Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Happy Monday, Dr. Paul.
Good. I want to talk about an unintended consequence of policy. So often governments make plans. They don't work out so well, and sometimes bad things happen. And right now we want to talk about a news story that's been out in the last several days about they call it a global famine, but it's principally in 4 countries. And it's not like it's out of the clear blue. Some people would like to blame global warming for this, but there is some warming, but the warming and warmth and fire generally is coming from war, you know, and bad economic policies and bad understanding of what personal liberty and property rights are about. But there are people starving. Now, the UN is involved, but I don't think the UN is the answer. I think they're part of the problem. And those experts who watch these things say that, you know, in the next several months, 6 months or so, 20 million people could die of starvation. And you can find the pictures, and it is a mess, and it's a big problem. But right now, the only solution that seems to be offered is send more money to the United Nations. And of course, I've complained about foreign aid and assistance into war-torn countries out of great sympathy, because we'd like to, as Americans, say, well, here, take this money. If it's not in foreign aid, we'll donate money. Send it over there and get it off the page and take care of it. What they never find out is that's part of the problem. And sometimes it adds to the conflict, because what we want to talk about today, if it's an unintended consequence, what's this an unintended consequence are? And what is it? What is it a consequence of? And that of course will be up for opinion. But I have a very strong opinion, I believe you share, that this comes about not by accident, not out of the clear blue. It's not global warming. It has a lot to do with what we dwell on here, and that is our foreign policy.
Yeah, and there have been several pieces. We both looked at an op-ed in RT, and there's a New York Times piece not long ago talking about the threats of famine and actually existing famine. Of course, as you suggest, the New York Times, as is typical for the mainstream media, they frame it all as a function of that horrible Donald Trump cutting foreign aid. If only we gave more foreign aid, these countries wouldn't have famine. How dare he cut the spending? But as with everything, the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and what have you, the question really is, what were the antecedents? What precipitated the rise of Al-Qaeda? What precipitated the famine in the first place? And the one thing, and we'll go into a little bit more detail later, but the one thing these 4 countries that they mentioned, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen, the one thing they have in common is that they've been on the receiving end of an aggressive U.S. foreign policy for, in some cases, 16 or 17 years.
Right, and you know, famine is not a new term. It's been around as long as man has been on this earth. There's been people that go through periods of times of starvation, and there are various causes for it. But in recent centuries, it's usually related to some type of a government policy. And matter of fact, even our own country started off, they never described it as famine, but starvation, and people died. So in a very local sense, it was a famine, and that was at Plymouth Colony in 1620. Because when they came there, they were frightened. A few people, and they had to make a living, and they had to, you know, make sure everybody had food to eat. So they devised a socialist system. It was the land that they occupied would be collective, and all that they produced would go into one area, and then the governor, William Bradford, would distribute this fairly to each family. And so it was collective, and it was designed for safety and make sure everybody was taken care of. But guess what? It didn't work. It was a disaster. People didn't produce like they could have, and the production was low. And people started starving. A lot of people died. And it was only 2 years after that guess what? Bradford figured it out. Well, maybe there should be an incentive system. Maybe this socialism doesn't work. So that's when he decided to say, well, everybody gets a plot of land. And of course, we know the end of that story. It was fantastic. Production went up. The poor were taken care of. They had enough left over that they started trading with other colonies. And it was miraculous, mainly getting rid of the principle that the government should take care of. That is not exactly the problem here today, because there's more to it than the socialism that most of these countries are involved in. I mean, most of these countries are very poor African countries, and they're not champions of the free market, but they're also the victims of outside interference, and they're also the victims of IMF and World Bank and United Nations interference in a lot of things that have gone on, and they have created conditions that have led up to this catastrophe.
And I think you're right, even in the Plymouth colony, there's this idea of where your economy gets distorted, gets deformed, gets displaced, they move to a different place. And obviously the policy was bad, but when you distort an economy, when you disrupt an economy, and that's the other thing that they have in common, these four other countries, and in this case it was disrupted from not bad policies necessarily or exclusively, but from outside intervention. You look at Nigeria. How does that affected by U.S. foreign? U.S. hasn't invaded Nigeria. What the U.S. did when the U.S. overthrew Gaddafi and killed him in Libya, all of a sudden the guns scattered throughout the region. As we know, some went to Syria, to armed jihadists, but a lot of them went to Boko Haram, which is kind of an Al-Qaeda-linked group down in Nigeria. And when this group got this massive shipment of weapons, of course, their insurgency went on steroids, and that's completely disrupted the country and the agriculture and what have you. So there's the first problem there.
Yeah, and the countries that we've been involved with definitely have been destabilized. And in some countries we go in and we not only destabilize it, a lot of people end up dying. They don't even go through the process of famine and die of starvation. And when you think of it, the atrocious activity in the 90s when there was constant bombing of Iraq.
Yeah. And
the statement made by, people made the statement, and Albright was questioned about, well, what have we been doing? We've been bombing the infrastructure. And the water plants, and the people, and disease broke out, and there were tremendous problems, especially with the children. And it was estimated, and nobody's been challenging the estimate, that 500,000 people died from this, and this was our war in there. And Albright said that's true, but that's the price we have to pay to save people from themselves. So now we're seeing this consequence of, and things have to be really bad when they call it a famine. Hunger and poverty is something else. So we mentioned these four countries, but hunger and poverty is a characteristic of just about every place that we have gone. How many places can the neocons come to us and say, you guys are wrong, look how much good we did. Look how we have improved the conditions of the world by us going in there and teaching them about how to have an election. If you can think of a place, let me know where it is.
Well, I'll keep thinking. In the meantime, I'll go to country two, Yemen, and you mentioned bombing the infrastructure and how it affected the population. That is the case in Yemen. Currently, 300,000 children are infected with cholera right now, and they say 1 every 24 seconds. So that's a horrible, and it's a direct consequence of the 2-year Saudi war on Yemen. And unfortunately, that war is backed by the U.S. We refuel Saudi planes, we sell them weapons, we give them targeting data. But what are they targeting? They're targeting hospitals, food distribution centers. They blew up the port. The Saudis did. So this famine is a directly consequence of a Saudi war of aggression. Now, I do have to say there's a slight bright spot in that an amendment passed on the House side on the defense authorization bill, limiting some of what the U.S. can do with Saudi Arabia on Yemen. So we can cross our fingers and hope that stays in the final bill. But there's a little bright spot, but there's country two.
Yep, and you mentioned they bombed the ports, which was in essence a blockade. And I've argued, because sometimes the word blockade and sanctions are overlapping, but when you put on sanctions, you prevent things from going in, and people suffer the consequence. And that is why I try to call attention to that. That is an act of war. This is a ruthless act of war, of bombing, and it was done for the purpose that they couldn't have imports, which they purposely did this. And they always believe in this. This was a theory behind Iraq. Let's make it so despicable in there that the people will rise up and get rid of Saddam Hussein. Well, it didn't happen. It took a decade, plus a lot more killing and a lot more waste and a lot more ruthlessness on our foreign policy in order to get rid of him. So I would say that number 2 spot is not doing well, and I would say that we bear a lot, if not all, of the moral responsibility in collusion with Saudi Arabia.
Indeed. And the third one, Somalia. This is another story. I think it really is a story of blowback. Because the CIA got involved quite a while ago, right after 9/11. And what they essentially did is they started backing different warlords and telling them, okay, here's your incentive, go out and kill a bunch of Al-Shabaab, which is the Al-Qaeda branch there. And so they had the incentive, just like in Afghanistan, they would kill a bunch of people and say, well, they're all Al-Qaeda. And of course, they would look better in the U.S. eyes. The CIA would reward them. But what happened when they were killing all these people, a lot of them didn't have any contact at all with Al-Qaeda. And it infuriates a clan, tribal-based society there. It infuriated clans, and it caused things to keep going and keep bubbling and keep bubbling. Now we're active in the drone warfare in addition to the CIA's secret war there, and the place is completely topsy-turvy.
And you can be very confident that the excuse for us going in is going to be fake news. It'll be a lie. It'll be an outright distortion of why we're going in, because we're going to spread goodness and democracy. And they never come up with the real reason. Sometimes believe it or not, sometimes it involves oil. You know, that's the reason we're there. But no, it's always for goodness and to help people and to make things better for them. But there's no evidence that it ever does any good. Even with all the imperfections of the way the people were living before we got involved, I think it's essentially 100% that when we go in, we make things worse for these countries. And you know, in our system, there has been some built-in, supposedly, restraints on how our government operates. First, we shouldn't go to war internationally for the United Nations and NATO and all this stuff. Second, we should get explicit authority from the Congress, which we never do anymore. Third, we let presidents go in and start these wars under executive orders, and then the Congress and the people allow them to accommodate by financing it all. And so the policy is lousy, but the process is even more sinful, you know, of just doing what they want. And I don't see it changing. I still think we're very, very militaristic. We're very much involved. And of course, that's why, although I believe things will get better in the long run, I think this ends only when people wake up, but we can't afford it anymore. And of course, we're getting closer to that.
We are indeed. And it's interesting that you had mentioned oil, because our fourth and final country, it was very much about oil. And what I think is the most disturbing about South Sudan is the idea that it was all wrapped in a humanitarian intervention. You remember the Save Darfur campaign. You had to be so heartbroken over these people. They had to be separated from the evil Khartoum, the evil North Sudan. They had to be broken away. They were being slaughtered by their evil overlord president. When in reality, the fact of the matter was that all the oil was in the south. And the Chinese were threatening to get the concessions of the oil. The U.S. and the U.K. wanted to break it up and get that oil in the south, so they did it. It didn't work out because the Chinese got it anyway for the most part. And nobody's talking about South Sudan. Nobody cares about Darfur. Nobody cares about any of this anymore. They're all starving. So it's, in a way, it's sort of the most grotesque intervention, where you pretend that it's all about caring so much about people. And then when they start dying because of the famine that was created by undermining their economies in this way, nobody cares.
You know, there's another force out there that's being involved, and many unintended consequences coming from it, and that is, Soros's group, how much he's involved, and the NGOs that get involved, because they're in there all the time agitating. And then this whole idea that he's for the open society. You know, if you look at Soros generally and not in detail, and say, open society, isn't that what libertarians are for? We do like open society. We want travel and trade and all this. But when you look at it, it's exactly the opposite. He wants he wants his form of open society, and he wants government to dictate it, and he wants to set the rules and the stages. So that, I think, is a big problem, because what has it done to these war-torn countries? First, these groups go in and they agitate, and they're serving some special interest. And then the whole thing breaks down, and then people who still can walk and they're not starving to death, what are they going to do? They're going to look for a better life, so they start walking, and Soros finances them. And then we have the ridiculous policy, not only in Europe but here in this country, that we reward them. When they come, you take more money from the people who are having trouble here and give more, and put the people who are coming in special attention because they're really suffering. Yeah. And that's their idea of an open society, is to make them more aggressive and punish the people here and undermine what we have. So if this continues, we're going to have more poor people here. And if, I'm sure there's statistics now, in spite of the great prosperity we have, you can probably find some people who would like to have a little bit better nutrition in this country. But I mean, when you look at how many homeless people, 50,000 on a night in New York City, so there is the poverty here and a nutritional problem. But you know what we're doing here, the creation of this, our foreign policy, and then this interference by George Soros, and then the encouragement for migration, and then calling it, oh, this is an open society, we want to treat people equally. Well, maybe people should be treated equally by allowing them free choice on how they want to run their lives and what they want to do, and emphasize maybe property ownership and contract, which is really what is necessary for production. But no, there's very little effort spent on that. It's usually more force, intimidation, transfer of wealth, and then we end up with this crisis. So let's hope they're completely wrong on these predictions, but quite frankly, I think it'll be every bit as bad. It could be worse, because it doesn't look like all of a sudden these countries that we talk about, and others, even a country like Ukraine, I don't think all of a sudden there's going to be tranquility there. They said that the economy is doing poorly there because of that fighting that went on, and it seems to me, as I recall, we had something to do with the disruption of an elected government there.
Yeah, with George Soros, it's such a good point you make, because his open society is, everyone else needs to be open, but he's the most non-open person. Yeah. What he does is a mystery. All of his actions overseas, his NGOs, he doesn't have any transparency in these. And you know what's always interesting about what Soros does overseas? His policies, his NGOs, their actions, their preferences, they always track perfectly with U.S. foreign policy. If the U.S. is against one country, then Soros's people are in there pushing that policy. You never see this. He's almost a privatized arm of U.S. foreign policy.
I want to make a quick mention of a very famous, well-studied famine. That was the Irish potato famine. And I want to just mention that briefly, then let you give us a summary statement. But for years, even today, most people think that there was a blight on the potatoes and they destroyed the potato crop, and that's why they had the famine that lasted about 7 years or so. But when you study that, and there's some interesting stories that are on the Mises site, the Mises Institute site, explaining exactly what went on, and it had a lot to do with, a foreign government coming in and taking over. That was the British came in and took over the farms, and the Irish, and they imposed on them protectionism, the corn laws, and they ruined the market. And then the more trouble they had, the more the government interfered. And it turned out that, yes, there was a blight, but that was minor compared to the government interference. And guess what? The whole famine ended when they repealed the corn laws. And corn laws means protectionism. That's why we should be very careful about trying to take care of our own by protectionism, rather than looking for a fair deal and a better deal by trading with other people, rather than imposing our will and using our foreign policy to impose our will.
Indeed.
So what do you have for a little closing here?
Well, I think the final word is of no U.S. intervention in the Middle East and North Africa. We would have no ISIS, no Al-Qaeda, no famines. This is not rocket science. The lesson is easy. let's just leave these people alone.
That's good, and that's the old story about non-intervention. Non-intervention, whether it's non-intervention in foreign policy and the internal affairs of other nations, whether it's non-intervention in our personal lives and what our spiritual lives are all about, or whether it's the non-intervention of economic policy. If we're looking for peace and prosperity, it is there. And right now, we're talking about a consequence of a policy that is exactly the opposite, and very little interest and understanding of what freedom is all about and what free markets are and what liberty really would mean. So the problems are dire, but the solutions aren't that difficult. They're not difficult to understand. And believe me, whether it's the depressions and recessions that we have, go on and on, the more the government tries to solve it, that when you do the right thing, like the repealing of the corn laws, guess what? The famine that was existing because of bad economic policy all of a sudden changes things. So let's argue the case for the promotion of liberty in order to promote a free and prosperous society. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.